This is a great question. Could we expand the teams to get all the grunt work done and ship everything sooner?
That's a common misperception, isn't it?
That's really a common misperception across the industry. I mean, you can't expect to get work done faster just because you add people. A lot of this is, really design work and building work. I'm not the first to make this observation, but you can't have a baby in 1 month by putting 9 women on the problem. We have some comments about the channel, about the kernel stuff. So the other thing we see, and there's some stuff in the blogosphere about this, is this misperception that the only interesting way to get metadata in is going to be to edit the metadata by hand as users are importing data in.
Give me some scenarios about how people are going to get metadata into the system.
So that sort of suits my personal preference, but I think that most of my interesting metadata is actually going to come from my email.
Okay.
I have tons of metadata locked up in my email right now. All the list of people for whom it's interesting for me to talk to is completely encapsulated in my email, my messenger.
Right.
The timelines for everything I do is in my calendar and mail that I got. In fact, a lot of the documents that I work with are stuff that people mailed to me, right? And so, it's nice that I know the author of a document, but I might know why it's relevant to me because it came as an attachment on a mail message that somebody sent to me.
Right.
And so, there's a whole wealth of information about people and the metadata about people that's really just in the messaging and the communication that you can put in there. I mean, my email inbox is about 700 meg. Please don't tell my boss. And that's just, that's the history of communications in just the last 6 months in this project for me.
When I left NAC, I left with a gig of email.
Yeah, easily.
After a year.
And I don't have to go type stuff in about those mail messages. It's, our CA22 works just fine. Actually go find out who those people are, what they are, and what's happening to them. And then you add in my calendar, the contacts I do choose to build manually, the tasks I'm underway, the stuff I could see from a SharePoint site, the mail I get in my Hotmail accounts. That stuff really builds a very rich backdrop in order to put your data against. Okay. It's true that today for pictures, a lot of people are very used to typing in metadata, but that's really a very legacy thing. I mean, even the pictures I take with the camera I bought, 3 weeks ago, it's got a lot of metadata that I want. And the metadata I don't want is metadata that my computer could tell me about if it only knew how.
Right.
I mean, the fact that I took this, this picture at 7 a.m., before I got to work, before my first meeting of the day, really indicates it's probably a picture about family. Yep. And if I had location, it would be all the better.
Or a sunrise.
Exactly, or a sunrise, or subject matter. And the province of computers is to do that computation for you and tell you what the cool things are. And now that if we make the data itself accessible by applications in this regularly schematized format.
Plus, application developers who make photo apps now have a whole new way of adding metadata.
That's right, they have a place to put it.
Yeah, because I could build an app that puts a square on your face, for instance, and prompts me just to type your name in on a square. And that adds metadata into the site.
Absolutely. So even those cases where you are going to revert to some, user-entered metadata, the degree of automation that we can build over it, image scanners, MP3 taggers, email grovelers, Word document searchers. I mean, you look at what the document workflow guys do, guys like Documentum and SharePoint. They do a great deal of metadata management today, and they really don't expect users to type most of it in. You can actually get most of it out of the document itself. So I think that's a pretty big misconception. So there's some questions here about, like, are we still built on the Windows NT kernel? Of course we are, absolutely. A specific question about whether you could run WinFS over USB thumb drives that are FAT formatted, and absolutely not. I mean, the WinFS store is a big store. It's really aimed at the fast read-write access of disks. There'll be serialization formats, which is a fancy way of saying you could copy something out of a WinFS store onto a FAT thumb drive, take your FAT thumb drive to some other Longhorn machine, and copy it back in, and you'll have the item fully populated in the new store.
You can go to a Linux machine or a Mac.
You go to a Linux machine, and you'll have the bits.
Okay.
You might not know how to interpret those bits on a Linux machine, or a DOS machine for that matter.
You did on NTFS bits today,
right.
A JPEG file, for instance.
Well, see, so JPEG is an interesting case because JPEG is standard in the sense that everyone knows what a JPEG stream is, right? But if you took a Word document and put it on a Linux machine, you would only know how to read it if some application had decided it knew how to read Word documents, right? So it's really
But that's what you're saying. You have to have an app over there that understands the
That's right.
format you're reading, right? So JPEG, obviously, there's going to be a JPEG reader on almost every platform.
I assume exactly, exactly.
I just want to make sure that, because some of the other comments I've seen earlier is, oh, you're trying to lock in the world and make sure that
no, JPEG is still JPEG.
Okay.
But if you take a mail message, right, and you move it onto a FAT drive, it's going to be in some binarized format, which isn't to say you couldn't take a mail message and specifically export it to a .msg and take the MSG with you, but the whole business of going to transfer formats is sort of application specific. Just like getting into an XML-based format is application specific. We do have some really good XML capabilities in WinFS. You can take items and programmatically turn them into XML representations and do some interesting query and stuff over them, but I don't think that's relevant to this particular question.
Cool.
How do you as a user add, delete, and edit entries in the WinFS store outside of the host application? Well, by far the most interesting thing to do there is to go to your shell. And the shell is the user's embodiment of organization. So you have lists in the shell, and they point to different items, and those items will be created by many different applications. So you want a list with all the interesting things to do with a project you're working on, for example. You could have the list point to pictures. It could point to a calendar appointment for meetings you have about it, point to mail messages that you've received. And that's sort of the most interesting way to sort of organize your data. It's this great heterogeneous organizer of all this stuff. I'm not really doing it justice in my programmer's eye view description of it. The shell guys are really probably good to talk to.
All right. I'm going to be talking to them more too. So.
Oh, they've got some fantastic stuff. We're really excited to work with those guys. And even
unfortunately, they don't let me videotape it because they want to show it off next year.
I'd be jealous too. I'd want to save that thunder up.
Yeah.
And from the shell, not only can you organize those things and sort of view them, but there are interesting operations you can think of from doing from the shell, marking things with flags, or having it participate in multiple lists and so forth. So it's probably the biggest way outside of the original application you would do it. There are a number of technologies out there. There's another reference to Novell's iFolder and the Simius efforts, and another reference to Rise of 4 as well. And there's lots of point technologies that have pieces of what WinFS does, or will do in the Longhorn timeframe. But that's not the same thing as having a common application development platform across persistent data all around. It really does attempt to solve that from a very integrated way. And then when I talk about ecosystems changing for ISVs and so forth, it's because we're not just delivering point technologies about synchronization or point technologies about sharing. It's really a wholly realized incremental platform. That's why it's so hard to do in the first place. It'd be easier if you just lopped off parts of the problem. Well, there we go. Please make it clear that WinFS is more important to me than Avalon or any other user interface change will ever be.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I'm totally on board with that.
That's Josh.